respect may be due to the rights of private judgment. And no man feels more of it than I do. As I say, Madison has a deep Republican commitment in the rights of private judgment. I think that goes back to his interest in freedom of conscience and other things. He goes on, there can be no doubt there are subjects to which the capacities of the bulk of mankind are unequal, and in which they must and will be governed by those with whom they happen to have acquaintance and confidence. The proposed Constitution is of this description. The great body of those who are both for and against it must follow the judgment of others, not their own. So this is Madison, I think, the elitist, quasi-crypto-proto-aristocratic Republican that John alludes to, who I think actually fits that bill very well, and therefore could have provided an around treatment, kind of more robust discussion. So up to 1788, this model, I think, works up to a point very well. But I want to say beyond that, I think that there are 2.5 or 3 ways in which I think John's model breaks down, and an attempt to tell the story on a kind of more long-term basis would become more problematic. The first one, I think, goes to the heart of Madison's question, which is Madison is, of course, not thinking about republics within the framework of Florence, a kind of mountain-bound city, and a nice little, rather humid valley. Where you can walk, having taught there, you can walk from one end of the city to the other pretty much in 15 to 20 minutes. It'd be like walking from here to Lincoln Park, I suppose, but not to Wrigley Field. Would be. I like being on the floor. We have Addison, Belmont, Clark, and Sheffield. As for I'm a lifelong Cubs fan. So for those who are not Chicagoans, this floor is of some emotional significance to me. Just a chance to speak here. So, of course, Madison is dealing with the modern republic, which is, it's going to stretch at least from Maine to Georgia, and hopefully, and then, from the Atlantic to Mississippi. There's no question that it has to be a government based upon representation, for starters. But I think more important than that, there's no question in Madison's mind that the nature of the issues that are going to come before this republic were very different from the kinds of issues that would have dominated political thinking in 16th century Florence, which would have been, I think, first and foremost, great matters of state and Florence's relations with other city-states in Italy, and potentially with the dangers that arose to Italy from other sources. So Madison was thinking about a model of political economy which just does not have any kind of ready correspondence in a 16th century context. You need representation because of size. This is a point the Americans repeatedly agree upon. Democracy limited in the way that Madison had prudently set out to limit it as an analytical term. It's just not going to be a functional alternative to that kind of situation. So we start with that kind of fundamental difference where the nature of how one thinks about deliberation has shifted. And I think that point about deliberation, which John I think comes back to in the concluding chapter of the book, needs some further emphasis as well. Madison, I'm convinced, from a long time thinking about it, Madison was first and foremost fascinated or driven by his experience in legislative bodies. And I think he had a very modern conception of what legislation in a modern society would look like, the relationship between the process of using the legislative authority of the state and all the pressures that would come to bear upon legislators and legislatures from the interests that would be dispersed and defined in a geographically, socially, economically complex society. Madison, I think, was truly interested in the problem of legislative deliberation, which I think is an understudied problem in the history of political thinking. The question of how one thinks about legislation, and that's why I'm sorry that our colleague Jacob Soul can't be here, because I was just reading his book on, what's his book? The French guy, Colbert. Colbert's fascination with collecting information in multiple forms. He's got a great book. I've learned a lot from it. But I think the question about legislative institutions function in this way. So I think the whole notion of how Madison thought about deliberation was, putatively a very modern one, and goes well beyond what Magnum was thinking about. So that's point number one. Second point, which I think is closely tied to this, but may deserve separate mention, is if you look at the American Constitution that Madison helped found, and Madison wanted to move away from the principle that where annual elections end, slavery begins. And Madison felt that it's important, as other Federalists came to think, it's important to give legislators some time in office. Now, one defense of that is you want to try to insulate them from the body politic. You don't want them subject to election every year. You want to cut them some slack so they're not immediately subject to kind of political pressures at every interval. So 2 or as with 3 or 4 years would have been better. But another part of that story is, which I think is a more interesting part, is legislators would need longer terms, not just to be insulated from the people, but so that they would be able to learn what it is they were supposed to deliberate about. That's to say, the point of a 2 or 3 year term was it would itself be a learning process. And then legislators coming from different parts of the country would need to have the capacity to actually find out what it is they needed to know before they would be capable of acting. So there again, you see a kind of concern with the nature of deliberation, which I think, qualitatively goes beyond Machiavelli. And then the third point I'll just make in passing, which I think ties in with some of John's themes, but needs an 18th century reformulation, is the Madison, who was deeply skeptical about public opinion in 1787, 1788, was not locked into that position. And that's where I think the difference between Madison and Machiavelli. Machiavelli is driven out of politics and never gets back in. And so he has this wonderful opportunity to think and to write and reflect deeply. And we can think about all the complex ways in which to tie the Prince and E. Discorsi together. But of course, Madison didn't have that kind of retirement until he finished a political career that culminated in the presidency. I happen to think, and I've written about this biographically, he's a deeply empirical thinker. Exactly the way Machiavelli is, except his deep empiricism was rooted in the actual conduct of public events. So very quickly, by the 1790s, you start to see Madison thinking and rethinking some of the positions that he had adopted in the 1780s. And I think that deep concern is about public opinion, about how you mobilize it, or I should say maybe his deep fear about it, or his anxieties about it. I think that gets moderated pretty quickly. When Madison starts writing what are called the party press essays in 1792, is already thinking about public opinion in a much more creative way. It's a wonderful book on this subject. I don't know if the people on the panel know it, by Colleen Sheehan, James Madison, the principle of Republican government or self-government, which actually is a wonderful account of how French writers influenced Madison. So that, I think that kind of dynamic conception of public opinion was something that was not available to Machiavelli. So what I'm trying to say here is it seems to be, thinking about Madison the way that I do, I think it's quite useful to think about him as a latter-day Machiavellian. And there are lots of ways in which I think his story fits John's analysis in just the way he suggests. But as historians like to say, it's more complicated than that. And once you add the complications, you wind up with a rather different picture. That's a wrap.
Well, now let's hear from the author.
Thank you, Julie.
And then we'll open it up.
And since Jack mentioned his name, I'd like to first thank Jake Saul for putting this panel together, although I wasn't sure I was going to thank him after I enjoyed the experience, but it was his idea, and even though he's not here, I thank him for that. And I thank the participants who each, in their own way, know certain components of this book